Please, act like we're lovers. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just, please, don't let go.
The parking structure was almost silent. Just the rain, coming in sideways through the open concrete walls, turning the city lights of Milan into long, bleeding ribbons of gold and amber on the wet floor below. The kind of rain that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives. And suddenly everything is cold, and everything echoes, and there is nowhere to hide from either. Cassandra's heels hit the wet stone in sharp, precise clicks. Not running. She couldn't run. If she ran, he would know. And Dax always used fear the way other men use charm, as the first thing he reached for and the thing he enjoyed most. So she walked, fast, controlled, her chin level, her jaw tight, her heart absolutely slamming itself against her ribs like it was trying to break out and go somewhere safer without her. She had come to this gala because Ostavio had told her it would be good for her career. Dress well, smile at the right people, hand out cards. She'd worn the beige cardigan over the white top because it was professional but not cold. She'd pinned her auburn hair up at the start of the evening. It had long since come down, falling past her shoulders in loose, unraveling waves. The kind of hair that starts the night neat and gets undone by everything that follows. She hadn't planned on Dax being there. She never planned on Dax. He simply appeared, the way he always appeared, in the exact place she had believed was safe. Behind her now, somewhere in the amberlit dark of level 2, she could hear his footsteps. And that was the thing about Dax that no one who hadn't lived with him would ever understand. He didn't rush. He had never once rushed. Why would he? Rushing implied you were afraid of not catching up. Dax had never been afraid of anything because in 2 years, nothing she had ever done had actually stopped him. He walked with the slow, unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how this ended. Her eyes swept the level. For cars. All dark. All locked. She could tell without trying. She had learned to read locked doors from a distance the same way you learn to read weather. Quickly, and because your survival depends on it. The elevator at the far end of the structure glowed faintly. It was 40 feet away. Maybe 50. She ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers. Fast, clean, without letting hope interfere with arithmetic. She would not reach it before he reached her. 35 feet. Cass. His voice. Calm. Conversational. The voice he used when he wanted her to understand that she was embarrassing herself. Don't do this again. 30 feet. She kept walking. 25. That's when she saw him. He was standing beside a black Maserati near the only working overhead light on this level. The one that hadn't given up against the dark. Tall. Broad. Completely still in the way of a man who has never needed to make himself smaller to fit into a room. His dark hair was slicked back with effortless precision. His charcoal suit was expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself, the collar of his white dress shirt open at the throat, a phone held loosely to his ear. He was speaking quietly to whoever was on the line. She couldn't hear the words. She wasn't listening for them. She was listening to Dax's footsteps behind her. 20 feet. She had approximately 3 seconds to make the kind of decision that changes the entire direction of a life. She had no information. She had no plan. She had a stranger by a Maserati and the sound of Dax's shoes on wet stone and 2 years of knowing exactly what happened when she didn't find a way out. She made the decision. She walked straight to him, slid her hand through the curve of his free arm, pressed herself against his side with the practiced ease of a woman who had been doing exactly this all evening. Close, natural, like she belonged in the space beside him and had simply stepped away for a moment and come back. She tilted her face up toward his with just enough ease to sell it to anyone watching. And then, very quietly, so quietly it barely disturbed the sound of the rain, she said the words that would change everything. Please, act like we're lovers. I'll explain everything, I promise. Just please, don't let go. The man on the phone stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw his face fully, sharp jaw, heavy-lidded dark eyes, the kind of beauty that has nothing warm in it, the kind of face that has looked at a great many difficult things and remained completely, terrifyingly unmoved. He took her in the way you take in a situation rather than a person, quickly, completely, without missing anything. The fear she was hiding behind the composure. the courage she was hiding behind the fear. He ended the call. Without explanation. Without a word to whoever was waiting on the other end. His arm came around her waist. Slow. Certain. Like a door closing. Amore, he said clearly, for the parking structure to hear. His voice was low and accented, Italian wrapping around the single word like it had been built for it. I was wondering where you'd gone. And just before Dax's footsteps reached them, before everything that was about to happen began, Cassandra felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Safe. She didn't know yet that the man holding her was Alfred Armani. She didn't know that his name made rooms go quiet and lawyers go pale and rivals go very still. She didn't know that she had just walked out of one kind of danger and directly into the arms of the most powerful, and most dangerous, man in northern Italy. She only knew that his arm didn't waver. And for right now, that was everything. Welcome to Story Lens TV, where we bring you stories that reach inside your chest and refuse to let go. If you've ever had to be braver than you felt, if you've ever taken a leap toward a stranger because staying still hurt more than the unknown, then Cassandra's story was written for you. Before we go any further into the night that changed her life forever, do something for me right now. Hit that like button if you believe that sometimes running toward the unknown is the most courageous thing a person can ever do. Subscribe to Story Lens TV so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below and tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Because somewhere right now, someone just like Cassandra is finding the courage to let go of what's hurting them. And I want to know you're out there. Now let's go back to the rain. Let's go back to Milan. And let's find out exactly who Alfred Armani is, and why, of all the strangers in that parking structure, it was him that fate placed in her path. Dax had always known how to make an entrance feel like a trap closing. He came around the rear of the nearest car with his hands in his jacket pockets and a smile that had absolutely nothing behind it. The kind of smile that had probably worked on a great many people who hadn't yet learned to read the distance between what a man's mouth does and what his eyes are doing at the same time. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of handsome that photographs well and feels wrong in person. His jaw was tight beneath the performance of calm. His eyes went immediately to Cassandra, and the look in them, proprietary, practiced, already composing the version of this story he would tell later, made her press slightly closer to the arm that hadn't moved. There you are. His voice was warm, fond, and completely without warmth or fondness. He said it the way you speak to something that has briefly wandered outside its designated area. Let's go, Cass. We don't need to make this a whole thing. Alfred did not move. His arm stayed exactly where it was, settled around her waist, warm and immovable as architecture, as though the man approaching them was a mildly interesting weather event he had already decided required no action on his part. Dax's gaze moved to Alfred then. The smile recalibrated. The charm shifted registers, the way it always did when Dax encountered someone he needed to assess before dismissing. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said, extending the pleasantness a little further than it wanted to go.
I'm Dax Mercer.
Cassandra and we had a disagreement earlier. These things happen. I appreciate you keeping her company, but she's with me. Alfred looked at him. That was all he did. He simply looked at Dax Mercer the way a man looks at something very small that is producing a surprisingly large amount of noise. Not with contempt, not with anger, with something quieter and far more deflating than either. A kind of complete, unhurried assessment that arrived at its conclusion almost immediately and found nothing there worth the energy of a full response. There's no misunderstanding, Alfred said. His voice was low, accented, built for quiet rooms and understood in loud ones. She's with me. Dax's smile tightened at the corners. Just slightly. Just enough to show that the pleasantness was load-bearing and had just been asked to carry more weight than it was designed for. I don't think you understand what I'm saying. She's my girlfriend. This is a private matter. I'm asking you respectfully to step back. She's your girlfriend, Alfred said. He said it the way you repeat something back to confirm you've heard it correctly before pointing out that it is factually incorrect. That's right. Alfred glanced down at Cassandra then. Not to check her expression for permission. Not to verify the story. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you already know the answer and you're letting them know that you know. His eyes were dark and steady and completely unreadable, and for just a fraction of a second, so small she almost didn't catch it. Something in them asked her a question she didn't have words for yet. Then he looked back at Dax. She doesn't appear to agree with that characterization. Cass. Dax's voice dropped then. Just a degree. Just enough to let her hear the real thing underneath the social performance. The cold, the ownership, the particular brand of patience that was never really patience at all but the controlled surface of something that would not stay controlled indefinitely. Come here. Right now. We're going to go inside and talk about this like adults. Cassandra's fingers tightened on Alfred's sleeve. She felt, rather than heard, the slight shift in the air. A change of atmosphere. The kind you feel in a room before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. And then, from the far side of the parking level, in the shadows between two parked cars against the wall, two large men in dark suits stepped forward. They didn't rush. They didn't speak. They moved with the particular unhurried weight of people who have never once needed to hurry, positioned themselves at angles that covered both the elevator and the stairwell, and then stood very, very still. Dax saw them. She felt the exact moment he did. Not because he said anything, but because the quality of his breathing changed. The confidence that had been in his posture, that loose, proprietorial ease, recalculated itself in real time. His eyes moved from the two men back to Alfred. Something crossed his face that he was too practiced to let become fear, but that was, unmistakably, a close relative of it. You should enjoy the rest of your evening, Alfred said. The pleasantness in his voice was absolutely genuine, which somehow made it worse. Alone. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Dax Mercer smiled one more time, the one he kept in reserve for situations where he needed to exit without appearing to retreat, and he turned and walked toward the stairwell. The two men let him pass. He didn't look back at Cassandra. He didn't need to. The look he'd given her before he turned had said everything he needed to say. It had said, "This isn't over. I know where you sleep. I know who your firm partner is. I know what you need from this city, and none of that has changed." It had said all of that without a single word, and Cassandra had spent 2 years learning to read it fluently. His footsteps disappeared into the stairwell. The door closed. The rain kept coming in through the open walls. The amber lights reflected in long, unsteady lines across the wet concrete floor. And then Alfred looked down at her, and for the first time since she had grabbed his arm, the full weight of what she had just done settled over Cassandra like the cold. Completely, from every direction at once. "You're shaking," he said. "I know. Are you hurt?" She thought about the question seriously, which was itself an answer of a kind. "Not yet," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said something she couldn't hear to the man on his left, who nodded once and disappeared. And Alfred Armani, without any particular ceremony, guided her toward the elevator with the arm that had not moved from around her waist since the moment she had asked him not to let go. He had not let go. She was still deciding what to do with that. The lobby of the hotel was warm and golden and full of the quiet, expensive noise of a charity gala in its final hour. Glasses, low laughter, the kind of conversations that are really negotiations wearing evening wear. Cassandra was aware of how she must have looked. Hair undone by rain and adrenaline, cardigan damp at the shoulders, the specific expression of someone who has been running without running for 40 minutes and has only recently stopped. A man appeared before they had crossed a third of the lobby. He seemed to materialize from a gap between two conversations, stone-faced and efficient. His dark suit immaculate in the way that said he had not been anywhere near rain or drama this evening, which meant he had been exactly in its vicinity and had managed it without a crease. He looked at Alfred first, then at Cassandra with the particular expression of someone who is professionally non-judgmental but is nevertheless registering and filing every detail for later consideration. Alfred said something brief and low. The man, Vero, she would learn his name in the next 30 seconds. Nodded, glanced at the lobby entrance, and then produced a car key from his inside pocket with the smooth economy of someone who has spent years anticipating the next required thing before being asked to provide it. Alfred looked at her. "Is there somewhere safe you can go tonight?" Cassandra opened her mouth. And then she did the thing she had been trying not to do since the parking structure. She actually ran the numbers. The real ones, without the optimistic adjustments she'd been applying to keep herself from panicking. The apartment was Dax's. His name on the lease, his furniture, his art on the walls, and his silence in every room. Her closest colleague at the firm, Petra, who was kind and funny and would absolutely feel professionally obligated to loop in Ostavio before morning because that was the way the firm operated, and Petra was not someone who burned things for other people, not really. Her family was in Atlanta. It was past 3 in the morning there. She had €200 in her bag and a hotel room number that Dax had written down in his phone the week she'd arrived in Milan, and had never once forgotten. The answer was no. The answer was no, and she had known it was no since she ran from him in the ballroom, and the knowing had been sitting in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying at a polite distance from her own attention. No, she said. Alfred said, I see. He did not offer sympathy. He offered Vero the car key back and said something else in Italian, and Vero turned and walked toward the exit, and Alfred looked at Cassandra and said, Come. Not a question, not quite a command. Something in between, the kind of sentence that assumes competence on both sides and moves on. She came. The Maserati was black and quiet and smelled like leather and cold air and something darker that she couldn't name. Vero drove. Alfred sat beside her in the back seat and looked out the window at Milan turning itself inside out in the rain, and Cassandra sat on her side of the car and tried to remember how to breathe correctly, which was something she had apparently forgotten how to do at some point in the last hour. The silence in the car was not uncomfortable. That bothered her slightly. It should have been uncomfortable. She was in the back seat of a car belonging to a man whose name she did not yet know, going to a location she had not been told, after an evening that had produced more adrenaline than most people experience in a calendar year. The silence should have been taut and strange. It wasn't. It was simply present. Like the rain. Like the city lights smearing past the window. Like the steady, untroubled quality of Alfred's breathing beside her, which was the breathing of someone who had not found this evening in the least bit alarming. Who are you? She asked. He didn't look at her. There was a pause, not long, not deliberate, just the natural weight of someone who is deciding not how to answer but how much of the answer to give. Then,
Alfred Armani.
Cassandra looked at his profile. The sharp jaw, the precise hair, the open shirt collar against the dark suit. She turned the name over, and then the name landed where names like that land, in the part of professional memory that files things under learn this quickly, know this completely, never forget you know it. Every legal intern in Milan learned the Armani name within their first 10 days. Not in a corporate directory, not in a press release, in the careful, specific way that one colleague leans toward another over espresso and says it quietly, the way you say the name of a thing that doesn't need to be said loudly to be understood. She had just run from Dax Mercer, directly into the arms of Alfred Armani. She felt something almost like a laugh threaten the back of her throat. The specific, slightly hysterical kind that arrives when a situation has become too absurd for any other appropriate response, and swallowed it very firmly. Alfred, apparently still looking at the window, said, You're free to leave. At the next light, if you prefer. A beat. But it's midnight. It's raining. And wherever you go, he'll find you before morning. You know that. She did know that. She stayed. The residence was in a quieter quarter of the city, behind a gate and then a courtyard and then a door that required 2 separate keys, which said something about the kind of life that was lived inside it. It was beautiful the way that a great deal of money spent with tremendous restraint is beautiful. Everything in it was exactly what it was supposed to be and nothing more. No excess. No decoration for decoration's sake. The floors were dark stone. The walls were pale. The furniture was sparse and perfect and arranged with the precision of someone who either had extraordinary taste or had paid someone with extraordinary taste a great deal of money to exercise it on their behalf. It felt like a place where no one actually lived. She would later learn that it was exactly that. A place Alfred kept precisely because it looked like no one lived there, which made it the safest kind of place to be. Vero disappeared somewhere after the front door closed. Alfred showed her to a guest room at the end of a corridor. Large, simple, white linens, a window that looked out over a courtyard full of rain. He left towels on the chair beside the door and told her, without inflection, that Vero would be downstairs all night if she needed anything. Then he walked back up the corridor without another word. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while. She called her mother and said she was fine, which was the kind of lie that mothers accept because they know the full truth can wait until their child is actually fine and ready to tell it. Her mother said she sounded tired. Cassandra said she was. Her mother said to drink water and sleep. Cassandra said she would. They said goodnight, and she sat there a while longer in the quiet, listening to the rain against the window, and then she took off her shoes and lay back on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling and thought, "What is happening to you, Cassandra?" It was not really a question. She was asleep in 4 minutes. The first time in months she had fallen asleep without lying awake waiting for a sound. In the morning, Alfred was already in the kitchen. He was fully dressed, dark trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to the elbow, hair already perfect. At 6 in the morning, which was a level of personal discipline Cassandra found simultaneously impressive and faintly suspicious. The espresso machine had already run. 2 newspapers were open on the counter, one Italian, one English, and he was reading the Italian one in the manner of a man who reads the news the way other people conduct morning briefings. Not for enjoyment, but because information is a tool and he does not begin the day without his tools. He looked up when she came in. She was wearing the same clothes she'd slept in, which was to say the same clothes she'd worn the night before, because she had nothing else, and her hair was doing something complicated and ungoverned that she had addressed briefly in the bathroom mirror and then decided was simply the truth of the morning and made her peace with it. Alfred looked at her. Back at his newspaper. "Sit down," he said. "Coffee, please." He poured it without being asked again, which she noted. He made breakfast, eggs, bread, something with tomato that she didn't catch the Italian name of, with the same efficiency he appeared to bring to everything. No fuss, no performance. Just the systematic production of food, placed in front of her at the counter without ceremony. She ate. He read. After a while they talked. Cautiously, in the careful way of 2 people who are circling the edges of something they're not yet ready to name. He asked about her work. She answered carefully, the internship, the law firm, the specific kind of ambition it takes to come to a foreign country alone at 26 and try to build something from nothing. He listened in the way she was already beginning to recognize as his particular style of listening. Completely still, not performing attentiveness but simply giving it the way other people gave nothing. She asked about him. He answered carefully, which was to say he answered in ways that were technically complete and substantively limited, the verbal equivalent of a room with all its furniture removed. She learned that he had grown up in Milan, that he ran a business, that he rarely slept more than 5 hours. She learned nothing else, and she had the distinct impression that she was not yet authorized to. "Why were you at the gala?" he asked eventually. She explained. Ostavio's firm, the charity circuit that doubled as a professional social landscape, the expectation that interns attend and be useful and visible and accommodating, and the way that Dax had been connected to the Varelli family through his investment work, which meant that anywhere Ostavio's firm went for the last 8 months, there was a reasonable chance Dax would also be there, which was something she had been navigating with increasingly thin resources. Alfred said nothing while she spoke. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a quality of attention that went from conversational to something more focused, more deliberate, the way a lens adjusts when the subject clarifies. He was filing information. She could feel it. Then Vero appeared in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was apparently simply how Vero moved through spaces, and said something low in Italian. Alfred looked at him, then at Cassandra. "Excuse me," he said, and left. He was gone for perhaps 8 minutes. When he came back, he set his espresso cup down on the counter and looked at her with the same neutral precision he brought to everything. "You won't be going back to that firm," he said. Cassandra put down her fork.
I'm sorry.
Ostavio Ferri has been using interns from international placement programs as social commodities for approximately 6 years. Introductions at events, social obligations, the expectation of availability that has nothing to do with legal work. You are not the first person to find themselves in a compromised position because of his firm's relationship to families like Dax Mercer's. He paused. "I've known about it for some time. I now have a reason to act on it." She stared at him. There was a very particular feeling she was becoming familiar with in Alfred Armani's company, which was the feeling of being simultaneously deeply grateful and faintly dizzy with the speed at which the ground kept rearranging itself beneath her. She did not know whether to thank him or to point out that she had not asked him to make decisions about her career. She did not know whether she was a guest or a project. She did not, if she was being completely honest with herself, know anything about what was happening or why, and the legal training that had gotten her this far was producing exactly one coherent response, which was, get more information before you react. She was grateful. She was also terrified. She was both of these things simultaneously and with equal sincerity, and she suspected that this was going to be the operating condition for the foreseeable future. All right, she said. Alfred looked at her for a moment, as if he'd expected something else. Then he picked up his espresso, returned to his newspaper, and the morning continued. And if you're watching this and thinking, she should have asked more questions, she should have pushed back harder, she should have called someone and gotten out, I want you to pause for just a second and think about what it actually feels like to have nowhere to go. To be in a foreign country with your options cut from beneath you one by one until the ground you're standing on is exactly this small. Cassandra was not naive. She was not reckless. She was simply, for the first time in 2 years, in a place where no one was hurting her. And sometimes that is enough reason to stay. At least for one more morning. The days that followed had a strange, suspended quality. Like the moment between lightning and thunder, when you know what's coming but the world is briefly, illusorily quiet. Alfred came and went from the residence with the regularity of a tide and the predictability of nothing at all. Sometimes he left before she woke. Sometimes she found him still in the kitchen at midnight, working at the counter with documents she never looked at directly, because she had developed, quickly, instinctively, an understanding of which parts of Alfred Armani's life were available to her and which operated behind glass. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was contained in the specific way of a man who had decided some years ago that showing anything was a form of exposure he could not afford, and who had practiced the decision so long and so thoroughly that it had become simply how he moved through the world. He was also, she was slowly discovering, quietly attentive in ways that said more than warmth would have. The second morning she found a phone on the kitchen counter. Not her phone, a new one, Italian SIM, untraceable to her name or Dax's surveillance. No note, just the phone and beside it the espresso already made. The third morning her coat, which she had left in the gala's cloakroom and had been carrying a low-level grief about ever seeing again, was hanging on the hook by the front door. She stared at it for a moment, trying to work out the logistics of its retrieval, and gave up. The fourth morning there was a bag on the guest room chair containing clothes in her size. Simple things, a few shirts, jeans, a cardigan that was dark gray this time, as if someone had looked at the beige one and made a quality assessment and acted on it. She came out of the guest room holding the cardigan and found Alfred at the counter and looked at him and said, "The cardigan." He looked up. "You sent someone to buy me clothes." "Vero bought them." "You sent Vero to buy me clothes." "You had one set of clothes." "I could have bought my own clothes." "With what?" "You have 200 euros. She opened her mouth, closed it. The frustrating thing was that he wasn't wrong, and Alfred Armani appeared to be consistently, serenely unaware that being correct was not the same as being welcome. She looked at the cardigan. It was actually very soft. She put it on. "Thank you," she said, with a formality that was doing the work of several more complicated sentences. The corner of Alfred's mouth moved. Very slightly. So slightly that she almost decided she'd imagined it. He looked back at his newspaper. "The gray suits you better," he said. She went to make herself coffee and decided, privately, that this was probably as close to a compliment as Alfred Armani got before 7 in the morning, and that she would take it. It was on the fourth evening that the walls came down. Just slightly. Just enough. She had found the spices in a market 2 streets away. She'd gone out with Vero trailing her at a respectful distance, which she had stopped being self-conscious about and started thinking of as simply a fact of her current environment, like the weather, and she'd bought what she needed for a Ghanaian pepper stew because there was a specific kind of homesickness that food can address when nothing else can, and she needed something that smelled like her mother's kitchen in Atlanta. Like Saturday mornings, like a version of herself that existed before Milan and Dax and 2 years of slowly learning to take up less space. She was stirring the pot when Alfred appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard him come in, the front door, the coat, the particular quality of his footsteps that she had already, without meaning to, memorized, but he hadn't come to the kitchen directly, and she'd assumed he'd gone to his office. Then she looked up and he was there in the doorway, still in his jacket, and he was simply watching her with the expression of a man who has come across something unexpected and is deciding what to do about it. "Sit down if you want," she said. "It'll be another 20 minutes. He sat at the counter. He watched her cook with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was complete and still and slightly unnerving until you got used to it, at which point it became something else. Something that felt she was discovering oddly like being seen. She talked while she cooked because the kitchen always did that to her, loosen something, and she told him what was in it and why, and he asked 2 precise questions that told her he was actually interested and not simply being polite, which was a distinction she had learned the hard way to notice. She made him taste it before it was done. She held out the wooden spoon across the counter with the matter-of-fact expectation of someone who has been making people taste things in mid-preparation their entire life and has never once been refused. He looked at the spoon. He looked at her. He leaned forward and tasted it. There was a silence. "Well?" she said. "It needs nothing," Alfred said. A pause. "It's the best thing I've eaten in months." She smiled. And Alfred Armani, who she was beginning to understand smiled approximately as often as solar eclipses occurred, looked at her smile and something in his face shifted. Not softened exactly, but became less defended. As if a room that had been operating with the curtains drawn had, briefly, let in some light. They talked until 1 in the morning. He told her about his father. Not all of it, not the worst of it, but the shape of it. A man who had built the Armani name from nothing and had done so with equal parts brilliance and a particular ruthless efficiency that left no room for the people inside it to be anything other than instruments of the enterprise. A man who had died when Alfred was 27, expecting his son to continue exactly what he'd started and to feel grateful for the inheritance. Alfred talked about it the way people talk about weather that has finally passed. Accurately, without drama, and without any pretense that it hadn't been very bad. She told him about law school. About the afternoon the acceptance letter arrived and she sat in her car in a Walgreens parking lot in Atlanta and called her mother, and cried so hard she couldn't make full sentences for 3 minutes. About how her mother had just stayed on the phone and said, I know, until the sentences came back. About what it meant to come to Milan and what she had believed was possible here before Dax had quietly, systematically dismantled her belief in it.
Alfred listened.
Not performing listening. Actually doing it, present, still, all the way there. When she finally said goodnight and stood up from the counter, she was at the hallway entrance when she felt his hand. Brief, light, just his fingers curling around hers for a single second before releasing. She turned around. He was already looking back at the table, as if it hadn't happened, as if the hand had made its own decision and he was allowing it a moment of plausible deniability. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the warmth of his hand, and about how safe she felt, and she hated it a little because she knew. She knew the way you know things you've learned through damage, that feeling safe was not the same as being safe, and that she had believed in safety before and it had cost her 2 years and the version of herself she'd been when she arrived. And yet, she fell asleep anyway, which meant, she thought, right at the edge of consciousness, that some part of her had already made a decision her mind was still pretending to deliberate. The call from Vero came on a Thursday morning. Alfred was gone before she woke, which she had stopped reading as avoidance and started reading correctly, as simply how he operated. She was at the kitchen counter with her coffee and a notepad full of research about law program applications, which she had been quietly building for a week, when her phone lit up with Vero's name. He told her in the careful, measured voice of someone delivering a live explosive. Dax had gone to Ostavio. He had told the firm that Cassandra had removed client documents from the office, physical files and digital copies, on the evening she left the gala. He had framed it as theft with the specific vocabulary of someone who knew exactly which immigration and professional conduct statutes would be invoked by the allegation and who had consulted somebody about it before making the call. She sat very still. Alfred already knows, Vero said. He'll be back within the hour. He was back in 40 minutes. He came into the kitchen and looked at her and, without preamble, told her everything Vero had told her, exactly as it was, without softening a single word. She had noticed this about him already. Alfred Armani never managed the truth in someone else's direction. He gave it to you straight and then he waited. She absorbed it. She did not cry. She asked, In a voice she was keeping very level what her options were. He listed them. Specific, numbered, realistic, the options of someone who had already thought 3 moves ahead and was presenting her with the map rather than the decision, which was, she was discovering, a characteristic of Alfred's help that she had not encountered from anyone in 2 years. He was not telling her what to do. He was telling her what was possible and letting her navigate. She listened. And then, at point 3, she said, "That won't work." He paused. "The immigration notification timeline," she said. "If Ostavio files through his firm's legal team rather than directly, there's a gap of 14 days before it triggers a formal review. That changes the order of operations. You'd want to address the firm first, not the immigration office." Something crossed Alfred's face. Surprise, she thought, or the very controlled version of it that he allowed himself. He was used to people asking him to act. He was not, she suspected, used to people pushing back on his thinking. He considered what she'd said. Then he said, "You're right," and adjusted the third option. That night, Alfred made calls. By the following morning, Ostavio's allegation had become a problem that no longer existed, dismantled by forces she wasn't told the details of and had decided, for now, not to ask about. Dax's access to her family contacts had been quietly, surgically severed. When she thanked him, he said, "Don't thank me." A pause. "Help me understand something." "What?" He looked at her across the kitchen counter. "How long did you let him do this before you ran?" The question was not cruel. It did not have cruelty in its architecture. It was simply honest, the way a scalpel is simply precise, and it found, with perfect accuracy, the thing she had been stitching closed since the night she ran from him in the parking structure, the wound she had been carrying with such practiced concealment that some days she could almost believe it wasn't there. She told him, all of it. The beginning of it, which was a conference welcome reception and a man who had known everyone and had turned all of that knowing in her direction and made her feel, for the first time since arriving in Milan, like she wasn't invisible. The middle of it, which was the slow, barely perceptible narrowing of the world, the friends who stopped fitting the schedule, the phone that started feeling observed, the apartment that had her name on nothing, and the way she had explained each of these things away until the explanations outnumbered the facts and she had gone on explaining because the alternative was acknowledging what the facts actually said. The end of it, which was not a single dramatic moment but an accumulation. One evening in the apartment when he had held her arm hard enough to leave a mark she'd covered with a long sleeve for 4 days, and she told herself it was an aberration, and then 3 weeks later when it had happened again, and she'd run the numbers on that too, the way she always ran numbers, and the numbers had finally said, "You already know what this is. You've known for months. The question is only when."
Alfred listened.
Completely still, completely present. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch. He did not offer her the things people offer when they don't know what else to do. The sorry, the how awful, the reflexive sympathy that is really just discomfort looking for a way out. He sat with it, with all of it, the way you sit with someone in a room that is difficult because the sitting is the thing that's needed and everything else is noise. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should have run sooner." She looked at him. "I'm glad you ran when you did," he said. "But you should have run sooner." And something about the simplicity of it. Not "you poor thing," not "how did you let it get so bad," not judgment and not pity, but just the clean, unadorned truth of it. The acknowledgement that yes, she should have, and yes, she didn't, and both of those things were true and neither of them defined what came next. Broke something open in her chest that had been sealed for a long time. The tears came quietly. Not the dramatic kind. The kind that arrive when something that has been held at tremendous effort is finally, simply set down. Alfred got up. He brought her a glass of water. He set it in front of her on the counter. He sat back down across from her and did not move and did not speak and did not leave. She drank the water. She let herself cry for exactly as long as it needed to be, which was not very long, because she had been keeping things in practice too long to be undone completely, and also because there was something about being in the same room as Alfred that made her feel that falling apart entirely was not necessary. That held together was available. That she could put it down without putting everything down. When she looked up, he was still there. He looked back at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she thought, not for the last time, that she had absolutely no idea who this man was, and that she was increasingly, alarmingly certain that she wanted to find out. Outside, Milan was still raining. Inside, for the first time in a very long time, Cassandra felt something that was not quite safety and not quite peace but was, unmistakably, the beginning of both. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. They sat there in the kitchen until the rain slowed, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first quiet that had felt like quiet in 2 years. And somewhere in the city, Dax Mercer was making other plans. But tonight, at least, he was very far away. And Alfred Armani was not going anywhere. If the story is reaching you, if you've ever sat in a kitchen with someone and felt safer than you had any right to feel, or if you've ever stayed somewhere longer than you planned because leaving felt like a loss you weren't ready for, then you already know where this is going and you already know it's going to cost something before it gets there. Stay with it. Some stories are worth every moment of the difficult parts. This is one of them. The week that followed had its own quiet rhythm, and Cassandra began, cautiously, to inhabit it. She had stopped thinking of herself as a guest somewhere around day 4. Not because the residence had become hers. It was still too precise, too undecorated, too much a place designed for function rather than living, but because she had stopped moving through it like someone who expected to be asked to leave. She used the kitchen fully. She rearranged the books on the shelf in the sitting room into an order that made more sense to her and waited for Alfred to notice and say something. He noticed on the second day. He said nothing. She took this as permission. She had also started going out. Not to the firm. That chapter was closed in a way she hadn't fully processed yet. The closing of it carrying the specific complicated grief of a thing that was both a loss and a relief simultaneously. But to a university library 3 streets away, where she could sit at a long wooden table with good light and an internet connection and begin the slow, methodical work of mapping what came next. Visa options. Graduate program timelines. The landscape of international law in Italy and what a person needed to navigate it without the structural support of a firm that had, as it turned out, never been supporting her at all. Vero accompanied her the first 2 days. He sat 2 tables away and read a newspaper and did not speak to her for the duration of either visit, which she respected entirely. By the 3rd day, Alfred told her she could go alone. She went alone. And then, about a block from the library on the 4th day, she happened to notice a man in a dark jacket reading a menu outside a cafe who was there again on the 5th day, and on the 6th, and whose presence coincided, she realized, with every outing she had taken. She never saw him look at her directly. He was very good at it. She suspected that was rather the point. She was not afraid. She admitted to herself on the walk home one afternoon, genuinely moved, which she knew she should not be. She knew the operational logic of it. Alfred Armani protected things in his vicinity, and she was currently in his vicinity, and this was no different than locking a door or checking a window. It was not personal. It was structural. She knew all of that. She was moved anyway because she had spent 2 years in a version of surveillance that had felt like walls closing, and this felt nothing like that. This felt like someone standing between her and the dark without making the dark her responsibility to explain. She was thinking about this on the afternoon she came home to Raised Voices. She heard it before she opened the door. Alfred's voice, low and controlled, and another voice, lighter, warmer in register but with something underneath it that her nervous system clocked before her brain did. The door opened on the tail end of a sentence she didn't catch, and she found Alfred standing in the center of the sitting room and another man by the far window who turned when she entered with the smooth, immediate ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. He was handsome. That was the first thing. The genuinely, consciously handsome of a man who has always known it and has spent time cultivating its usefulness. Dark hair, lighter build than Alfred, a suit that was fashionable rather than simply expensive. He smiled at her with his whole face, and that was the thing she noticed, the thing that her 2 years of hard-won education in the architecture of dangerous men filed automatically. His eyes were doing something completely different from his mouth. His eyes were measuring, categorizing, running a calculation she wasn't authorized to see the result of. So, he said pleasantly, warmly, with the specific sociability of someone who wants you to feel welcomed and is entirely aware of the effect. This is the woman causing all the talk. Alfred moved. Not quickly, not obviously, but she felt the shift. A step, a realignment, the way a door moves to stand between 2 spaces. His body was between her and Silvano without it looking like that was what had happened. She's not a subject for discussion, Alfred said. His voice was the same quiet it always was. It landed differently than it had in the parking structure, she thought. In the parking structure it had been cold. Here, in his own space, directed at someone who shared his blood, it was colder. The kind of cold that comes from heat that has been fully, deliberately suppressed. Silvano's smile shifted, adjusted, recalibrated, remained. He lifted both hands in the small gesture of a man who is surrendering ground strategically rather than conceding it. "Of course," he said pleasantly. His eyes moved to Cassandra one more time, quickly, precisely, and then back to Alfred. They said something to each other in Italian then, fast and low, and she caught nothing of it except the texture, which was the texture of two people who have a long and complicated history and are currently in the phase of it where the complication is running close to the surface. Silvano left. She heard the front door close. Alfred stood where he was for a moment, and she watched the specific thing that happened to him after. A settling, a return to the ordinary baseline of his composure, like a surface resolving after something has passed through it. "I don't like him," Cassandra said. Alfred turned. He looked at her for a moment. "You have good instincts," he said. "Has anyone ever told him no?" "Yes," Alfred said. He picked up the folder Silvano had apparently brought, which was now sitting on the table rather than in anyone's hands, and moved it to the counter with the air of a man filing something under to be dealt with later and not in good temper. Not in a way that lasted. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. About what it meant for something to be told no in a way that didn't last. About whether the Silvanos of the world ever actually learned the word or simply learned to reroute around it until the obstruction was no longer there. The terrace at the back of the residence was small and iron-railed and overlooked a courtyard of old stone and a lemon tree that had no business being as alive as it was in a city that got this much rain. She had discovered it on day 3 and had been returning to it in the evenings when the weather permitted, which in Milan in this season was approximately 40% of the time. She liked it because it felt exterior to the careful neutrality of the residence's interior, a place where the city was audible, where she could hear traffic and voices and the ordinary noise of people living their lives at the normal volume, which was a sound she had missed without knowing she'd been missing it. She was reading on the terrace when Alfred came to tell her dinner was ready. She had heard his footsteps on the stone floor inside, the pause at the terrace door, the door opening. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with the easy, unthinking stillness he carried everywhere, and the light was behind him from inside, and the city was behind her, and somehow they had arrived in the same moment at a proximity she hadn't planned for, and apparently neither had he, because when she stood up from the chair they were very close. Closer than the practical geometry of the situation required, and for the first time since the parking structure, neither of them stepped back. He looked at her for a moment that lasted considerably longer than the occasion seemed to call for. Then he kissed her, slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of a man who has thought about a thing completely before doing it and has, in this case, decided. It was not tentative and it was not hurried and it was not anything like the way Dax had kissed her, which had always had an ownership in it, a prior claim being asserted. This was different. This was a question being asked with full respect for the possibility of no, and when she kissed him back it was her answer stated plainly, and he understood it, and his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that had nothing performing in it. He pulled back first. The city was still going about its business behind her. Somewhere in the courtyard, the implausible lemon tree was doing whatever lemon trees do in the rain. Alfred looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she could see the thing he was going to say gathering in his expression before he said it. The honesty arriving ahead of the comfort, the way it always did with him. "I'm not a good man, Cassandra." "I know," she said. "You should be afraid of this." "I know that too." A pause. He held her gaze. "And?" She looked at him, at this man who had put himself between her and a threat in a parking lot without a second's hesitation, who had bought her a gray cardigan because the beige one was wet, who had sat across from her in a kitchen and stayed while she cried without offering her the insult of easy comfort. This man who ran something she didn't ask the full details of and told her the truth about it anyway and let her decide. "And I'm still here," she said. Something in his face, not softened because Alfred Armani did not soften, that was simply not a thing available in his range, but opened. Just slightly. Just enough. He looked at her for another moment. Then, almost to himself, Yes, you are. They went inside and ate dinner, and neither of them mentioned the terrace, and the food was very good, and the silence was the best kind, the kind that has something living in it. The week after that was the loudest week of Cassandra's time in Milan, and she had spent part of it in a hostage negotiation that had not been labeled as such but had functioned as one. Leonida Armani arrived on a Tuesday morning without warning. Cassandra heard her before she saw her. Heels on the front hall stone, decisive and unhurried. The specific cadence of someone who has never in their life required an invitation anywhere. She came around the kitchen doorway to find a woman who was perhaps 60 and looked like the architectural drawing of someone 60 in the way that a cathedral looks like the architectural drawing of a building. Entirely correct, unanswerable, and slightly intimidating regardless of what you believed. Silver hair. A structured dark coat. A face that had been very beautiful and had decided, somewhere in the middle years, that beautiful was a lesser priority than formidable. She looked at Cassandra the way you look at something that has been placed in the wrong position in a room you are responsible for and which you are waiting for someone to have the courtesy to correct. Not hostility exactly. Something more controlled than hostility. The particular discipline of a woman who has spent decades treating her own emotions as logistics. Then Alfred appeared from the corridor, and Leonida switched entirely to Italian. She addressed him completely, continuously, at a measured volume that was doing a great deal of work. Cassandra stood at the kitchen counter with her coffee and understood nothing and was not meant to understand anything, which was the point, which was why she kept her expression entirely pleasant and her posture entirely calm, because she had learned from 2 years of Dax that the most maddening thing you could do to someone who wanted you flustered was to be insufferably composed. Alfred responded in English. Every time. Without comment on the choice, without explanation. Simply redirected the conversation into a language she could access as smoothly as a river reroutes around a stone. She watched Leonida's jaw tighten by precisely the amount required to indicate she had registered this and had chosen not to address it directly, which Cassandra suspected was as close as Leonida Armani came to being outmaneuvered. They were gone from the kitchen within 20 minutes, into the office, and Cassandra refilled her coffee and returned to her library notes and did not press her ear to the office door, which she felt was worth acknowledging as an act of considerable personal discipline. She learned what was said later, from Alfred, who told her the way he told her everything. Directly, without management or softening. Leonida had said she was a liability. That the family's alliances, the specific generations-built network of affiliations that constituted the Armani family's structural power, required a particular kind of partner. That Alfred's association with a foreign intern with no standing and no family name in this world made him look compromised to the very people whose respect kept him safe. That sentiment was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. Alfred had said, "Her name is Cassandra, and you will use it." Cassandra heard this and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's all you said?" "I also said the conversation was over," Alfred said. "But that part was implied." She looked at him. She thought about the specific cost of that sentence, what it meant to say it to a woman who had, in all likelihood, shaped every major decision of his life until very recently. What it meant to say a name like a line in the sand. She didn't say anything, but she reached across the counter and touched his hand briefly, the way he had touched hers at the hallway entrance some nights ago, and he turned his hand over and held hers for a moment, and that was enough. The dinner Silvano arranged came 3 days later. It was framed, through Vero, through a message Alfred received and read with the expression of a man encountering exactly what he expected, as a welcome gesture. Family dinner. An opportunity to ease tensions and demonstrate, to whoever among the family's inner circle might be watching, that Alfred's personal life was stable and the concerns being whispered in certain rooms were unfounded. Alfred looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at Cassandra. Then he said, "You don't have to come." "Is it a trap?" she asked. "Almost certainly." She thought about it. "Then I'm coming," she said. "I'd rather know what the trap looks like than sit here imagining it." Alfred looked at her with something she was beginning to identify as his version of admiration, which was distinguished from his ordinary expression by almost nothing visible but felt entirely different. "Wear something that says you're not leaving," he said. She wore a deep burgundy dress she'd found in the city on one of her library afternoons, and she pinned her hair up the way she'd worn it to the gala. Neat, deliberate, the version of herself that had come to Milan to build something and still intended to. When she came out of the guest room, Alfred looked at her from the hallway with the stillness he wore when something had caught him off guard and he was managing his reaction, and said nothing and held the door open, and she thought, good. The dinner was at the Armani estate, a building of an older era, walls thick with history and intention, filled that evening with people whose smiles were doing the work that weapons did in other rooms. Silvano greeted them at the entrance with the warmth of a man who has planned every word of the welcome and is pleased with how it's going. He shook Alfred's hand. He turned to Cassandra with that wide, calculating smile and said how lovely it was to finally welcome her properly. His eyes said nothing of the kind. She smiled at him with equal precision. "Thank you for having me," she said. "What a beautiful home." She looked around the room at the assembled family members with the composed, warm attention of a woman who was entirely comfortable and had no reason to be otherwise. Silvano had wanted flustered. He had wanted out of her depth and visibly foreign and slightly overwhelmed by the weight of the room. She gave him none of it, and she watched the calculation behind his eyes adjust. Then Bricia walked in. She was objectively extraordinary looking, the kind of elegant that is built over generations rather than assembled. A carriage, a composure, a way of moving through a room that said she had been trained since childhood to understand that every entrance was also a statement. Her dress was white and perfectly fitted. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that took significant effort to appear effortless. She came to Cassandra with the specific grace of someone doing something they've rehearsed and have convinced themselves is spontaneous. "You must be Cassandra," she said, warmly, lightly, with the warmth and lightness of a perfectly sharpened instrument. "I've heard so much."
I'm Bricia.
A small, precise pause.
Alfreds ex-fiancée.
Cassandra received this information with a nod and an expression that said she found it entirely unsurprising and only moderately interesting. "How nice to meet you," she said. Bricia's smile held. "Alfred is extraordinary," she said. "I imagine you're still learning that." The message in the sentence was silk over the point of the sentence, and the point was, this is temporary for you and we both know it. Men like him, the world they live in, the things they carry, it takes a very particular kind of woman to understand it, to really be beside it, rather than just near it for a while. She touched Cassandra's arm lightly. "I only say it because I care about him. All great men eventually return to the life they were built for. Don't you think?" Cassandra looked at her. She took a sip of her wine. She considered the sentence at its actual dimensions. "That's interesting," she said. Her voice was even and warm and entirely without aggression. "You keep talking about him like he belongs to you, but you're the one who came to introduce yourself to me." A small pause. "If I were just a temporary distraction, I imagine you wouldn't have needed to." Bricia's smile tightened. "Just at the corners. Just enough." Across the room, Alfred had been in conversation with two men in their 60s, who had the look of family members who had been powerful long enough to have stopped performing it. But she felt, rather than saw, the moment his attention shifted. She looked up and found his eyes already on her. And in his face, private, warm, belonging only to this moment and this direction, was something that made Bricia, and the room, and every calculation being run in every corner of it, briefly and completely irrelevant. He held her gaze for just a second. Then he returned to his conversation. She finished her wine and accepted the next glass from a passing server and decided, quietly, that she was going to be fine. The evening was not fine exactly. It was effortful in the way that all beautifully staged traps are effortful to move through with your dignity intact. But she moved through it. And when Alfred collected her from a conversation with a cousin whose name she had already forgotten, his hand found the small of her back, and it stayed there for the remainder of the evening, and she thought that that particular choice, made in front of everyone in that room, was the clearest sentence Alfred Armani had ever said in her presence. She couldn't sleep that night. It wasn't the dinner, specifically, or Bricia, or even Leonida's measured disapproval still sitting in the air of the residence like weather that hasn't quite finished moving through. It was the accumulation of it. The sustained effort of moving through a world that treated her presence as a problem to be solved, and doing it with her chin level and her expression composed, took something from her that was harder to replenish than she'd anticipated. She lay in the dark of the guest room and stared at the ceiling and listened to the building settle around her and thought about how tired she was. Not of Alfred, not of Milan, even. Just of needing to be so much, so carefully, for so long before she was allowed to simply exist. At some point past midnight she got up and went down the corridor and knocked on Alfred's door. He opened it immediately. He was awake. Fully. Not the groggy half-presence of someone pulled back from sleep, but the alert, already thinking presence of someone who had not been sleeping. He was in dark trousers and a white t-shirt, and his hair, for the first time since she'd met him, was not perfect. Slightly unruly in the way of someone who had been running his hands through it in the dark while he thought about things he hadn't resolved. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Can I stay?" she asked. "Just to sleep. I don't want to be alone in that room tonight." He held the door open. She came in and he pulled back the covers on his side without ceremony, and she got in, and he got in on the other side, and the space between them resolved itself gradually. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but the way warmth resolves in a cold room, slowly and completely, until she was against his chest and his arm was around her and she could feel his heartbeat, steady and unhurried, against her back. "Your world is very loud," she said, to the dark. "I know. Does it ever get quiet?" A pause. His arm tightened slightly. "It does now," he said. She closed her eyes. He was still awake when she fell asleep. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness, the alert, watchful kind, not the loose weight of sleep. He was lying there with his arm around her in the dark, thinking about whatever Alfred Armani thought about in the middle of the night, and she was falling asleep inside the circle of it, and she thought, just at the edge of consciousness, that this was a thing she could not afford to become accustomed to and was already irrevocably accustomed to. And if something in this story is sitting with you right now, that specific feeling of wanting something you know you shouldn't need, of finding safety in the most unexpected place, I want you to keep that feeling close, because the next part of this story is going to ask something of both of them that they aren't ready for. Nobody ever is. She woke to a different kind of morning. She felt it before she opened her eyes. The bed was already empty on Alfred's side, which was not unusual, except that the quality of the silence in the apartment was unusual. Not the ordinary settled quiet of early morning. Something tighter. A silence that was paying attention. She found Vero in the corridor outside Alfred's bedroom door, which told her everything she needed to know about how the morning had already gone before she'd woken into it. Vero had the face of a man delivering news he has already organized into the most efficient order of presentation and is waiting for the signal to begin. The council meeting had been called that morning. Without Alfred's knowledge, which was the detail that sat worst, the one that said this had been constructed, planned, timed. The estate, 12 men. Silvano, who had apparently been building this particular structure for months, stone by stone, conversation by conversation, favor by favor, and had decided that this morning was when it was ready to be walked into. Alfred had gone to face it. He had told Vero to stay with Cassandra. He had not told Cassandra anything, because he had left before she woke. She sat with this for 30 minutes. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank it and thought about the options in front of her, which were stay as instructed and trust that Alfred Armani knew how to navigate something he had been navigating for his entire life, or go because she had not come this far and survived this much to sit in a residence and wait for someone to tell her what had happened to someone she was not going to name it, not yet, not in the middle of this, but she felt it in the exact center of her chest, steady and irrefutable, and that feeling was what got her off the stool. She told Vero she was going. Vero said Alfred's instructions were clear. She looked at him and said, very pleasantly, that she respected those instructions and was going anyway. Vero looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his operational parameters. Then he picked up his keys. The estate was 40 minutes from the residence. She arrived to find 2 cars she didn't recognize parked on the gravel, and the front door standing open in the way that front doors stand open when people have gone through them without pausing to close them, which meant things were moving quickly inside and no one was managing appearances anymore. The formal salon was at the end of the main corridor, and she heard it before she reached it, not shouting, which would have been easier to categorize, but the specific controlled noise of something formally irreversible being said. She stopped just outside the doorway. Through the gap she could see the room. 12 men in suits arranged with the particular geometry of a thing that has been staged. Silvano at the head of the table with the easy, proprietorial posture of someone who has already moved in and is waiting for the last piece of furniture to be removed, and Alfred standing at the near end, still, contained, wearing an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger, not surprise, but the face of a man who has looked at something he already knew, was true and is simply, finally, done pretending it might be otherwise. Leonida was seated along the far wall, not at the table, separate, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed into neutrality so complete it was its own statement. The abstention before the vote was taken. The specific cruelty of a mother's silence. Silvano was speaking. The words came with the smooth confidence of a prepared speech, unfit to lead, personal interests above the family, a foreign woman with no standing given access to the inner circle, a security risk, a distraction, a demonstration of weakness that the family cannot sustain. Each word was correct in its grammar and monstrous in its purpose, and it landed in the room with the weight of something that has been planned to be unanswerable. Alfred was stripped of leadership. She saw it happen, saw the moment Silvano said the words and the room received them. Some faces sorry, some relieved, most simply watchful, and saw Alfred look at Silvano for a long moment, then look at his mother, and then something in his face closed. Not broke, closed. The way a house closes when the last person has left and the door is locked and the windows are shuttered and whatever happened inside is no longer available to the outside world. He turned and walked toward the exit. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. She had heard everything. She had not moved. Her face was wet. She hadn't felt the tears arrive, hadn't noticed them, which was the thing about certain kinds of grief. It doesn't ask permission, and she was standing in the corridor looking at this man who had protected her in a parking lot and bought her a gray cardigan and sat with her while she cried and kissed her on a terrace and held her in the dark, and who had just lost everything he had been born into because she was standing in the doorway of his life when the walls came down. He crossed the room in a straight line. He took her hand. The first time he had done it in front of witnesses. In front of 12 men and his mother and Silvano, who had turned at the movement and whose expression, for just a moment, had something genuinely surprised in it, as if he had expected defeat to look different, as if he had expected Alfred to leave alone. Alfred walked them both out, through the corridor, through the front door, across the gravel, into the car. Vero drove. The silence lasted a long time. The city moved past the windows. Alfred sat beside her with his hands loose in his lap and looked at nothing in particular, and she sat beside him and did not fill the silence, because some silences are not asking to be filled. After a while, she reached over and took his hand back, just as he had taken hers. He looked down at their hands, then at her. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We move," he said. "Then I think." And then, a long pause. The city outside. The rain, which had started again, because in Milan the rain was apparently always available, always willing to provide atmosphere for the worst and best moments equally. "And then," Alfred said quietly, "I end it." She held his hand for the rest of the drive and did not ask what that meant. She already knew. The apartment outside Milan was anonymous in the careful way of things that are meant to be untraceable. Small, clean, functional 3 rooms, a kitchen that had just enough in it to produce basic meals, a window that looked out at a road and then a hill and then nothing much. Alfred had rented it under a different name 3 years ago and paid it from an account she had not known existed until he led her through the door and told her, with the matter-of-fact practicality he brought to all logistics, that no one who might be looking would think to look here. She unpacked what she had into the small bedroom. He made calls, quiet, rapid, almost entirely in Italian, moving through the apartment with a stillness that she now recognized not as calm but as the specific contained energy of deep planning. The way a body goes quiet when the mind is working at its full capacity. He told her on the second evening. He was going back to the estate. Alone. She argued. She put every version of the argument in front of him. The danger, the 12 men, the fact that Silvano was not a man who had arranged a coup and would simply accept its reversal without consequence. The fact that he did not know what she knew, which was that she had been thinking about this since the morning after the council meeting and that thinking had been producing things worth paying attention to. She gave him all of it.
Alfred was immovable.
"I need to know you're safe," he said. His voice was quiet and completely resolved. I can't be what I need to be and worry about you at the same time. What do you need to be? He looked at her. Alive, he said. I need to be alive. And I need to be thinking about one thing at a time, and if you're there, I will be thinking about you. Not the room. Not Silvano. You. Pause. That is not a position I can afford. She looked at him for a long moment. She wanted to be angry and found, with some surprise, that she wasn't. Not because she had surrendered the argument, but because she understood it. Understood that this was not dismissal. This was the most honest thing he had said to her, maybe the most honest thing anyone had said to her. The admission that she mattered to him at the operational level, that she was not background, that her presence had weight in his world that he could not diminish by planning, and that this was not weakness but simply what was true. She understood it. She hated it. Both of those things were entirely possible simultaneously. That night they came to each other in the quiet of the small apartment with the particular gravity of people who are aware that tomorrow might take everything, and who have decided, completely and without reservation, not to waste the night. He was careful. He was reverent. He watched her face the whole time in the way of someone who is committing something to the part of memory that does not get lost in the normal way, the deep storage, the place where things survive the worst. His hands moved over her with a gentleness that was not passive. It was active, deliberate, the gentleness of someone who is choosing it in full knowledge of every other option. When she said his name against his shoulder, he held her more tightly. When she finally fell apart in his arms, he held her through it and said her name against her hair. Cassandra, Cassandra. As if the syllables of it were something he was grateful for, something he had been given. Afterward he held her in the dark and she listened to his heart rate return to something ordinary and thought, whatever happens tomorrow, this happened. This was real. Whatever he faces tomorrow, this cannot be undone. And she discovered, in the thinking of it, that she believed in him. Not blindly, not the performed faith of someone who needs a hero. She believed in him the way you believe in a thing you have studied from close range and found, repeatedly, to be exactly what it appeared to be. She believed in Alfred Armani the way she believed in evidence. She slept. She woke to an empty bed that still held the warmth of him. She lay still for a moment, and then she got up, and through the window she saw the Maserati was gone from the road below. The morning was cold and gray and entirely unhelpful. She made coffee. She could not drink it. She sat down at the small kitchen table with her legal notepad, the one she kept in her bag the way a doctor keeps a stethoscope, always because she thought in legal pads and always had, and she sat there for a while. And then, because she was Cassandra, because she was 26 and Ghanaian American and had worked twice as hard for everything she had and had been in this residence and this life for weeks now, she began to write. Everything she had observed. Everything she had overheard. Every meeting Silvano had conducted in the residence when he believed she was out. The voices carrying through walls she wasn't supposed to be standing near. Every document she had seen misplaced on the counter or the edge of a table or left in the sitting room when the office was apparently occupied. Not stolen, not taken, simply there, briefly, in the way that things are left when people don't think you're paying attention. She wrote dates, names, numbers, the specific, compounded vocabulary of two families moving money in directions that did not align with their stated interests. She wrote the name Ferrante, which she had heard twice in conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. She wrote the account references she had looked at and then looked away from, because she was a guest and it wasn't her business, and then had remembered later with the involuntary precision of a mind that had been trained to retain exactly this kind of detail. She wrote for 2 hours. She filled 8 pages. When she stopped, she went back and read it from the beginning, and her chest tightened. She was a legal intern. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She was still looking at it when a knock came at the apartment door and Tamaro walked in with the careful, unhurried presence of someone who has been moving through difficult situations since he was young enough to have learned how. He was in his late 20s, younger than she'd expected when Alfred had said his name as the one person he trusted completely, and then more understandable when you spent 10 minutes in his company and felt the quality of his attention, the steadiness, the specific decency of someone who has grown up in proximity to the worst of what people are capable of and has decided, repeatedly, to be something else. He asked how she was. She said fine. He made coffee because her cup was cold and untouched. He sat across from her and was quiet in a way that did not require filling. Then she slid the notepad across the table. She watched his face as he read. She watched the specific transformation of his expression, the first page mild, the second page more focused, the third page very still, the fifth page something that was not quite alarm but was its close, better organized relative. He read all 8 pages. He read them twice. When he looked up, his eyes were different, the way eyes are different when the information behind them has changed. "Cassandra," he said. His voice was careful. "Do you know what this is?" She looked at him across the table. She thought about everything that had brought her to this kitchen, this notepad, this morning. She thought about a parking structure in the rain, and a stranger's arm that hadn't moved, and a gray cardigan left on a chair without explanation, and a man who had looked at her like she was the point of everything before he drove away into a morning that might be the last one. "It's evidence," she said. Tamaro sat back. He looked at the notepad. He looked at her. Then he took out his phone and made a call in rapid Italian, and the quality of the response on the other end made him sit up straighter, and when he ended the call he looked at her and said, quietly, "I need to take this to the estate." "I know," she said. "Alfred doesn't know you have this. I know. This changes everything. I know." He took the notepad and left. She sat at the empty table. She made herself eat something. She couldn't have said what, and then she could not sit anymore and she could not pace a small apartment for an indeterminate number of hours. So she stood at the window and watched the road and tried to think about other things and failed completely and did not pretend otherwise. Her phone rang. It was Vero's name on the screen. She answered before the second ring. His voice was shaking, which was the most frightening thing she had heard since the night she ran through a rain-slicked parking structure with heels clicking on concrete, because Vero did not shake. Vero was a man who could deliver bad news in a level voice in a burning building. The shaking meant the news was real. "Come to Milan," he said. "St. Raphael's private clinic." A pause that lasted 1 second and felt much longer. "He's alive. But come now." She did not remember the drive. She did not remember the road or the city or how they got there. She was at the window and then she was in the back of Tamaro's car and then she was in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and cold air and institutional quiet, and she was moving through it at a pace that was as fast as she could go without running, which was to say she was running, and she did not feel her feet on the floor. The door to the private room at the end of the second corridor was closed. She opened it. He was in the bed. Battered, the word didn't fully account for it. Bandages at his ribs, his shoulder, his forearm. Bruising along the left side of his face that had swollen the skin beneath his eye. His left arm was in a sling against his chest. He looked like something that had gone through something significant and had come out the other side by the sheer force of the same stubborn, unshakable will she had been watching operate in kitchens and terraces and formal salons for weeks. His eyes were open. He looked at the doorway. He looked at her. He exhaled. One long, complete, entirely unguarded breath. And it was the most undefended thing she had ever seen him do. More undefended than the dark of the small apartment. More than the kitchen at 1 in the morning. Just this one breath in and then out, at the sight of her in the doorway, that said, "You're here." That said, "I was not certain you would be, and now you are, and that is the only thing that has mattered since I drove away this morning." She crossed the room. She took his good hand in both of hers. She sat in the chair beside the bed and held on. "You're supposed to be in the apartment," he said. His voice was rough, used, wrung out, but entirely his. "You're supposed to be invincible," she said. A pause. The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm working on it." She let out a breath that had been sitting in her chest since the phone rang. He told her what had happened. He had gone to the estate with the evidence. Tamaro had arrived before him and had already begun presenting it to the council, quietly, methodically, page by page, with the steady precision of someone who understood that the best argument is not the loudest one. The evidence had been Cassandra's pages, organized into the language of consequence by Tamaro's knowledge of family law and precedent and the specific way these men understood liability. Silvano's dealings with the Ferrante family exposed. The account transfers, the private arrangements, the long-running negotiation with a rival power that amounted to a sustained act of betrayal against everything the Armani family had built. The theft from the family treasury, documented, dated, cross-referenced against figures she had seen on the edge of a table and committed to memory without knowing she was doing it. And Dax's payments, sourced from Silvano, made specifically to facilitate his pursuit of Cassandra as a tool to destabilize Alfred, to produce the optics of a compromised leader, to build the case the council had been presented with as though it had grown organically. The council had turned. Under an hour. 12 men, and the evidence had moved through them in under an hour. Silvano had fled when it became clear. He had not fled far enough or fast enough because the Ferrante family, the rival family he had been secretly courting at the expense of the Armani name, had received, through channels Alfred had opened for exactly this purpose, the information that Silvano had been using their negotiations as leverage while simultaneously working against them. The Ferrante family was not a forgiving organization. What happened to Silvano after that was not Alfred's doing. Alfred said this without inflection and without pretending to feel anything he didn't feel. Dax was in Italian police custody. The evidence file Alfred had been building for 6 weeks, alongside everything else, in the margins of everything else, with the particular long-game patience that was simply how he thought, had been delivered to the right hands that morning. Obstruction, immigration fraud, coordinated harassment, the paper trail of his arrangement with Silvano. He would be in custody for a significant time. He would not be calling anyone's family contacts from inside it. And Leonida, when the second vote was called, the vote that would either confirm the council's reversal or deepen it, had not voted against her son. She had also not voted for him. She had abstained, sat in the same chair along the same wall with the same composed expression and said nothing and raised no hand either way, and Alfred told Cassandra this quietly, without bitterness, with the particular equanimity of someone who has already fully processed a thing and arrived at the far side of it. It was what it was. It was, in its silence, the closest thing to an apology that Leonida Armani's architecture permitted. He would not ask for more than that. He was, she suspected, not certain more was available. He had formally surrendered leadership to Tamaro. Standing in the estate he had grown up in, surrounded by men who had watched him bleed for it and had nearly taken it from him, he had named the one person he trusted completely and had given it willingly. Not as defeat, as choice. The first choice in years that was entirely his, not inherited, not obligated, not the continuation of a thing his father had started and expected him to maintain. "You gave it all up," Cassandra said. He looked at her. "I gave up nothing," he said. "Everything I wanted to keep, I kept." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "You assembled the evidence that did this. You knew what you were looking at before anyone told you to look." "I'm a legal intern," she said. "It's literally what I'm trained for. You saved us." She looked at him, battered and bandaged and stubbornly, implacably alive in this private room. This man who had put himself between her and a threat in a parking lot and had never, not once, let go. "We saved each other," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he closed his eyes, and she sat with his hand in hers and listened to him breathe, and that was enough. That was, for right now, everything. He was in the clinic for 11 days. She visited every one of them. Recovery was slow in the particular way that Alfred Armani was slow at anything he did not excel at immediately, which was to say, with bad grace and significant resistance and a sustained running commentary on the clinical merits of every instruction the doctors gave him, which Cassandra pointed out was probably not useful and which he continued anyway. She brought him food from the market because hospital food was, he informed her on day 2, a form of aggression. She brought him newspapers and argued with him about his interpretations, which he seemed to enjoy more than he was willing to say directly. She held his hand when the pain was bad in the nights and he didn't ask her to leave and she didn't offer to go. Tamaro visited often. He came in with the careful, newly inhabited authority of someone who has just been handed something significant and is deciding, deliberately, to carry it differently than it was carried before. He asked Alfred's advice. Alfred gave it, without hesitation, without bitterness, without the resentment that would have been, she thought, entirely understandable. They talked for long hours while she sat in the chair by the window and read and listened and understood, slowly, that this was what it looked like when two people pass something between them that is heavy and do it correctly. With intention. With respect for what it costs. On the 11th day, the clinic discharged him, and they went to a different apartment than either of them had lived in before. Smaller than the residence. Higher than the anonymous room outside the city. A place they had found together. She had found it, technically, on a short list she'd assembled on her phone while sitting in a clinic chair on day 6. On the 5th floor of a building in a part of Milan that had art galleries and a good market and an espresso bar on the corner that opened at 5:30 in the morning, which she had noted specifically because Alfred. They furnished it slowly and with more disagreement than she had anticipated. He had opinions about furniture. Strong ones. Largely wrong ones. The conversation about the kitchen table lasted 40 minutes and ended with the table she had chosen and Alfred informing her, with great solemnity, that the second chair was poorly proportioned, and then ordering the second chair in the same design 2 days later without comment and placing it at the table and sitting in it and reading his newspaper with the expression of a man who has always known this was where the chair should go. She did not point this out. She sat across from him and smiled into her coffee. He caught the smile. "Don't," he said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." "The chair looks wonderful," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He turned a page. She enrolled in the law program in October. Her application had been supported by 2 professors Alfred had connected her with, not by calling in favors, she had been specific about that, and he had understood her to mean it, but by introducing her to people who had then read her application on its own merits, which were, as it turned out, considerable. She wrote the application herself in 4 drafts over 2 weeks. When the acceptance came, she came out of the bedroom where she had opened the email and stood in the kitchen doorway, and Alfred looked at her from the counter, and the expression on his face when he understood what had happened was the most completely unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. He crossed the room and held her face in his hands, and she could feel that he was not going to say the thing that would have been true, which was that he had known, that it had never been in doubt, because he understood her well enough by now to know that this was her moment and it did not require his certainty, only his presence. He kissed her instead. Said the same thing. Better. 3 months after the clinic. An evening in November when the apartment had been lived in long enough to feel inhabited, which was the thing that distinguished a place from a home, not the furniture or the art or the accumulated objects, but the quality of the air, which had absorbed enough ordinary life to feel different from unoccupied air. Cassandra was reading on the couch. Alfred was attempting to cook dinner, which was a project he had undertaken 3 weeks ago with the same committed seriousness he brought to everything, and which was producing food that was improving at a rate that she found privately impressive and publicly chose not to remark on, because he had responded to early remarks with a 40-minute exposition on the history of Italian regional cooking that had been interesting and had also been entirely deflection. Tonight, the garlic was wrong. She smelled it from the couch. She got up. She came to the kitchen and looked at the pan and looked at Alfred and said, with the gentle honesty that had become the texture of how they spoke to each other, "That's too much." "It's not."
Alfred.
"It's twice the amount. It's a different variety. The ratio adjusts." "The ratio does not adjust that significantly. You've made the dish once. I've made the dish 37 times. It's my grandmother's recipe." "Your grandmother," Alfred said, with the expression of a man who knows he is losing a factual argument and is attempting to relocate the discussion to philosophical ground, "was not Italian." "She was not," Cassandra agreed. "She was Ghanaian. And she made this dish better than anyone I have ever met. And she used 2 cloves, not 6. Alfred looked at the pan. He looked at her. A long pause in which she could see him weighing the options, which were to concede the point or to eat a meal that was going to be significantly over-garlicked. 3, he said. 2. Another pause. 2.5, he said, with the expression of a man making a significant diplomatic concession. There is no such thing as half a clove in this context. There is now. She took the pan from him. She adjusted the garlic. He stood beside her and watched with the particular attention he gave to things he was learning, which was total and slightly dangerous, and the dinner came together in the kitchen of the apartment that was theirs, and it was, she thought, the best argument she had ever had. They ate at the kitchen table. The poorly proportioned second chair performed exactly as she had expected it to. The food was very good. After dinner, Alfred was quiet for a while in the particular way that meant he was thinking about something he had already decided and was composing how to say it. She had learned to recognize this quality of quiet. It was different from his working quiet, different from his watchful quiet, different from the quiet of a man managing the contents of his own mind. This was the quiet of a man arriving at the end of a long journey that had brought him to a specific, unambiguous destination. She waited. He looked at her across the table. In the light of the kitchen, in the apartment that smelled like garlic and dinner and the life they had been quietly, stubbornly building together, Alfred Armani looked at Cassandra with the expression of a man who has finally, completely stopped being alone. Who has looked at that fact and found, with some surprise, that he does not want to change it. Not today, not for any version of tomorrow he can construct. Stay, he said, a simple word, one syllable. But in his voice, in this room, after everything that had brought them here, it landed with the weight of every word that had come before it. Not just in the apartment, he said. Build something here. With me. Be the person you were always going to be and be it here. I'll be beside it. I want to be beside it. A pause. He held her gaze. Stay. She looked at him. She thought about a parking structure in the rain, and 3 seconds and a decision, and an arm that did not move. She thought about espresso at 6 in the morning, and a gray cardigan on a chair and conversations that lasted until 1 in the morning and a hand caught briefly in a hallway. She thought about a terrace and a careful kiss and dark rooms and the way he said her name against her hair. She thought about evidence and courage and the specific unambiguous knowledge that this man, this complicated, dangerous, quietly extraordinary man, had looked at her, not the version of her that stayed small, not the version that accommodated and disappeared, but the full, unedited, argumentative about garlic assembles evidence on kitchen tables version and had chosen her. Repeatedly. In front of everyone. At significant personal cost. She thought about the difference between needing someone and wanting them. Yes, she said. It was not a complicated yes. It was the simplest thing she had said in 2 years. The truest. Alfred looked at her the way she had been told he looked at her by his mother and her own. Like she was the point of everything, and reached across the table and took her hand. The dinner party happened on a Saturday in December. Tomero came with his wife, Isara, warm, direct, effortlessly kind in the way of someone who has decided that the world is hard enough without adding unnecessary distance to it. Vero came, which he had done with the slightly formal bewilderment of someone who has been invited to something personal for the first time and is not entirely certain of the appropriate register, and who had spent the first 15 minutes of the evening talking to Alfred about things Cassandra suspected were work-adjacent until she had handed him a glass of wine and asked him what he had eaten for dinner the night of the parking structure, and he had looked so genuinely caught off guard by a question that had no agenda that something had relaxed in him and he had answered honestly and they had talked properly for the first time. The video call came at 8. Her mother appeared first. Her face filling the screen with the specific, complicated joy of a woman who has been worrying quietly for months and has been told by the person she was worrying about that everything is fine, and who needs to see that fine for herself before she can believe it. She looked at Cassandra. She looked at the apartment around her. She looked at the people in it. Her eyes went to Alfred. She looked at him for a moment in the way that mothers look at the people their children have chosen, with the full assessment of love, which does not miss anything and does not forgive anything and does not need to, because its standards are simply this: is she okay? Is she more than okay? Is she being taken care of in the way she deserves, which is completely, and does he know that? Then her father appeared beside her. Her father asked Alfred 3 questions. The questions were direct, specific, and not unkind, and they covered in 3 questions what a formal interview might cover in 20. Alfred answered every one without deflecting, without charm, without the social equipment he might have deployed in other circumstances. He answered with the plain, unhurried honesty that was simply how he operated, and her father listened to each answer with the focused attention of a man who is not deciding whether to approve but whether the person in front of him has earned his daughter's trust, which was a different and more important question. Her younger brother appeared briefly to interrogate Alfred about Italian football with the specific, relentless enthusiasm of a 22-year-old who has found an Italian man and considers this an opportunity not to be wasted. Alfred fielded this with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has faced 12 armed men in a formal salon and is discovering that this is somehow more demanding, and Cassandra sat beside him and listened to him defend the honor of a club her brother considered deeply suspect and felt something so uncomplicated and complete rise in her chest that she had to look away for a moment at the window and the city and the December dark, just to contain it. Her mother, in a brief moment when Alfred was occupied with her brother and Tomero, had drawn Vero into a separate conversation. He looks at you like you're the point of everything. Cassandra looked across the table at Alfred, who was now being asked about tactics with a seriousness that suggested her brother intended this conversation to last some time. I know, she said. Is he good to you? She thought about it. Not the easy answer, the one she could have given in 3 words. The real one, which was bigger than 3 words and which she had spent the last months learning the full dimensions of. She thought about what it meant to be asked what you needed before being told what someone wanted. She thought about a gray cardigan and a glass of water and a hand that didn't let go. He's the first person, she said quietly, who ever asked me what I needed before telling me what he wanted. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then keep him, she said. Cassandra smiled. I know. She already had. And she would, through every difficult thing that came next, through the ordinary dailiness of building a life in a city that had tried to take everything and failed, through law school mornings and late nights and the particular negotiations of 2 people who are both, in their own ways, accustomed to doing things alone and are learning, slowly and stubbornly and with occasional disagreement about garlic, to do them together. She would keep him, and he would keep her. And the parking structure and the rain and the 3 seconds that changed everything would become the story they told. At dinners, in quiet moments, to people who asked how they met and received an answer that was entirely true and completely unbelievable. Of the night that Cassandra walked toward the most dangerous thing in the room and found, against every reasonable expectation, that it was the safest place she'd ever been. That is what it looks like sometimes. Safety. It doesn't always arrive in the expected shape. Sometimes it arrives at midnight in a rain-slicked parking structure, wearing a charcoal suit and a face like cold architecture, holding a phone and deciding, in the space of 3 seconds, to say amore to a stranger who asks him not to let go. Sometimes the bravest thing you ever do is the thing you do in 3 seconds with no plan and nowhere else to go. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it is exactly enough. Thank you for staying with Cassandra and Alfred all the way to the end of this story. If something in it reached you, if you've ever had to choose between staying somewhere familiar that was hurting you and stepping toward the unknown, if you've ever found safety in the most unexpected place, or if you've ever been the person who simply refused to let go, I want to ask you something. What was the moment in this story that hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments because I read every single one, and those conversations are what make this community worth everything. If the story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Someone who needs to be reminded that running toward a stranger is sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Because the next story is coming. And I promise you, it is worth the wait.